Introducing first the master of disaster, the bokeh master himself, weighing in at 41.8 ounces, it's the Sigma 85 Art Lens. And his challenger, weighing in at 13.1 ounces, it's the Sony FE85 1.8. I hope that wasn't too over the top. Well, anyway, today I'm going to be comparing up these two lenses. And I know what some of you are probably thinking, which is, Dave, the Sigma 85 is Sigma's premium brand lens, whereas the Sony 85 1.8 is more their middle of the road. This is also a 1.4 versus the Sony being a 1.8. So why, Dave, don't you compare up the Sigma Art lens to the Sony G Master lens? Well, there's two very simple reasons for that. First is price. You see, this is about $600 versus this being about $1,000, and the Sony G Master is like $1,700. So these two are priced closer to each other than this is to the G Master. That's point number one. Point number two, I don't have the G Master to compare them. So this is what I've got. This is what we're going with. So we'll obviously cover the usual areas of build quality and how they handle on the camera and what the image quality is like, what the autofocus performance is like, etc, etc, etc. For anyone who wants to jump to a particular section, I will leave timestamps up here for you so you can just jump to whatever the part of the video you like. But before we kick off, it is worth noting that this Sigma lens is not a native FE mount setup. It is actually the Canon DSLR version with the Sigma MC11 adapter on. But that's not actually going to make that much difference to the overall outcome of this review, because the Sigma FE version is just an adapted DSLR lens, so optically it's still exactly the same. It's still going to be the same size, pretty much the same weight. The only difference will be the fact that the firmware in this lens is designed for Canon DSLRs and is being converted by the adapter, whereas the FE version of this lens will have autofocus firmware specifically designed to work with the Sony cameras. So the autofocus performance of the FE version should be slightly better than this, but the rest of it is going to be exactly the same. So let's look at the exteriors. Well, obviously there's one big noticeable difference, which is just the sheer size of the things. So the Sigma lens with the adapter on is kind of close to double the length of the Sony lens. It's also 3 times heavier as well. So there's definitely a noticeable difference when you are shooting with it on the camera. Now, when I've been using this on my A7 III, it is still hand-holdable. You know, it's not like it's too big and heavy to physically use on the camera. I mean, if you're walking around with this on your camera all day, it's going to start taking its toll on you after a while. And also, just because the lens is so heavy, then there's a bit of a front tip. Now, in terms of the fit and finish of this lens, I've always been a fan of the Sigma Art lens. You know, the look of this lens, I do like it. It's a very sleek design. The finish to this lens is a mixture of metal and thermal composite plastic, or plastic. There's also a very large focus ring here, which is really smooth to turn. So if you are using this for manual focusing, if you are using this for video work, it's a very smooth, accurate focus ring that's very easy to find because it takes up 3/4 of the body. The big drawback to this lens, apart from just the sheer size and weight of it overall, is the front filter, because this thing takes 86mm front filters, which was a pain for me when I bought it because all of the filters that I owned were 77mm, which means I couldn't use any of them on this lens. And 86mm front filters don't come cheap. Now, if you are a fan of big, heavy, large lenses, this is probably right up your street. But if you are not a fan of carrying around a 1.2 kilo lens, then you should consider this. Now, compared to the Sigma, this thing's an absolute featherweight. You don't even notice you're holding it after you've been holding the Sigma for so long. Now, partly this is a lot lighter because there's nowhere near as much glass inside. The Sigma's made up of 14 glass elements in 12 groups, whereas this is made up of only 9 glass elements in 8 groups. The glass elements themselves are also a lot smaller. The Sigma being an 86mm front filter, this is only 67. Another reason why this is so much lighter is it doesn't carry the same build quality as the Sigma. But before you write this lens off as just cheap crap plastic that'll break as soon as you touch it, I might know a friend of mine who accidentally dropped theirs on concrete. Yeah, this might have accidentally took a tumble out of my kit bag. But to be fair, working perfect. Like the Sigma, this lens also has a switch for selecting autofocus and manual focus, but it also has a little function button here, which on the Sonys allows you to customize this button in the camera body to do any feature you like. So you can set it to start up your autofocus, you can set it to bring up a particular menu if you so desire. I personally have that set on my lenses to initiate the eye autofocus. So if I'm trying to take a portrait, I can just push that button and the camera is going to immediately lock onto the subject's eye. From an on the camera body experience, I'd pick this over the Sigma any day of the week. It's a much smaller lens, so it's a lot less obtrusive if you're trying to take more candid photos of people. From my experience, a lot less people noticed when I was trying to take a picture of them using this lens than when I was trying to use this lens. So from a usability point of view, I personally prefer the Sony, but how do they stack up in terms of performance? Well, the first noticeable difference is the fact that this is a 1.4 versus this being a 1.8. So you get 2/3 of a stop more light through this lens than you do with this. However, if you look at these two photos of a rather glorious looking model, the Sigma image is on the right, the Sony is on the left. Now, these were taken at their widest apertures. So the Sigma was shot at f1.4 while the Sony was shot at f1.8. But to compensate for that, I balanced them out with the shutters. So the Sony is shot at a 500th of a second, whereas the Sigma is shot 2/3 of a stop faster at 800th of a second. And looking at these two images, the Sony appears slightly brighter than the Sigma, which suggests that while it might have a 2/3 of a stop slower aperture, it's got either better light transmission or a better t-stop value, so is able to actually get slightly more than 2/3 of a stop less light in than the Sigma. The Sigma obviously still lets in a lot more light because it's f1.4, but rather than it being a 2/3 of a stop difference in real terms, it's actually more like a half a stop. Now, one thing I do want to highlight with these two images is on the t-shirt, because we have quite a high contrast area here where it's black and white, and we can see how the lenses perform with chromatic aberrations because both lenses are wide open, so this is where chromatic aberration is gonna appear most apparent. Both of these lenses exhibit color fringing. Forward of the point of focus, it's a purple hue, and beyond the point of focus, it's more of a greener hue. Both of them appear to show similar levels of chromatic aberrations, but you've obviously got that 2/3 of a stop advantage with the Sigma. So if you stop the Sigma down to f1.8, the chromatic aberration is all but wiped clean, whereas the Sony obviously still has it. Now, one thing I thought I noticed with those images was how they were framing me up, because the camera was static on a tripod, never moved, and I stood on the same spot for both test images. And yeah, it looked like the Sony lens was framing me up slightly tighter than the Sigma, but I wasn't entirely sure. So I went ahead and did another test shot of a clock on a wall. Again, camera static on a tripod, clock static on the wall. And here are the two side-by-side images, and you can see the clock on the Sony lens is fractionally bigger than the clock in the Sigma lens. Now, that's obviously not going to be a deal breaker, because in that situation, if I'd moved the camera forward a centimetre or two, it would have matched the framings up. But it's just another point worth noting that it's not a true 85mm compared to the Sony. Now, while we're at the clock on the wall, let's look at image sharpness. So both lenses at their widest aperture in the centre of the frame, as you can see, both of them are fantastically sharp. Now, obviously, the clock's slightly away from the wall, so we can't use the wall as a reference because it's on the wrong focal plane. But as you can see, that wooden plank at the side of the clock is the same distance away because it's still tack sharp in both images. And if we look to the top of the plank, you can see that the Sony is still really sharp at its widest aperture, whereas the Sigma has dropped off slightly.
But the Sigma's obviously at f1.4, so it's slightly more challenging. If you bring the Sigma down to 1.8 as well, then it's just as sharp as the Sony. And from here on in, both lenses are pretty much dead level with each other in terms of overall sharpness. Once you get down to f2.8, both of these lenses are pin sharp all the way across the frame. In terms of vignetting, at their widest apertures, both of these lenses have very similar levels of vignetting, but obviously the Sigma has that 2/3 of a stop advantage. If you bring the Sigma down to f1.8, the vignetting clears up very nicely. So in terms of image quality, there's not really a lot of difference between them. Both lenses are pretty much the same as each other, namely, fantastic. Now, neither of these lenses are macro lenses, they're obviously more portraits and that sort of thing. But just for the record, in terms of close-up performance, the Sigma has a minimum focus distance of 2.8 feet, whereas the Sony has a minimum focus distance of 2.6 feet. But like I said, neither of these are actually macro lenses, so that information is probably pointless to most of you. Now, let's look at autofocus performance, but let's obviously remember that this is an adapted DSLR lens, not the native Sony mirrorless. So I think if we were to test this with the FE version of this lens, the results would be slightly different. But in terms of autofocus performance, both lenses work pretty well. But depending on the situation you're using the lenses in, is going to get very different results. The Sony, being a native Sony lens on a Sony body, the autofocus works faultlessly. It's fantastically accurate. It works with all the Sony features like the eye autofocus and stuff like that. It doesn't make any difference whether you're shooting outside or in a dim lit room. This thing has no issues with acquiring focus. It's also absolutely silent, and I mean silent. Couple this thing with an electronic shutter at a wedding ceremony, nobody's going to even know if you are taking pictures. Just for comparisons, here is a close-up audio recording of the Sony lens autofocusing. And here's the Sigma. So in terms of autofocus noise, the Sigma is certainly more audible than the Sony, but overall it's not stupidly loud. It's still a pretty quiet autofocus system. In terms of autofocus accuracy, this lens works very well. As I've said in a previous video, when you use the Sigma art lenses on a DSLR body, then the autofocus consistency can be a little bit temperamental, particularly if you are autofocusing towards the edges of the frame. On a mirrorless camera, however, you don't get that same inconsistency. I found this setup to be extremely accurate pretty much all the time, even when you have the autofocus set up to the extreme corners of the frame. Now, this lens doesn't have the eye autofocus functionality that the native Sony lens does, but I believe that the FE version of this lens will have. What I did find interesting with this lens, though, is the autofocus speed and how it varies. See, with the Sony, the autofocus speed is pretty much consistent in all circumstances, regardless of whether you are in good light or bad light, whether your subject is close or far away, the autofocus always runs at the same sort of speed. With the Sigma, this isn't the case. If you are focusing in good light and the subject is a reasonable distance from you, then the lens locks on focus. In fact, it seems even faster than the native Sony lens. However, if you try focusing near the lens's minimum focus distance, then you find that there's almost a hesitation and the lens hunts quite a bit before it finally locks focus. And if you photograph in low light, then the lens's autofocus speed gets slowed down. Now, it is worth noting as well that the slower autofocus in dimmer light is not just a trait of this lens on a mirrorless body. I noticed it with all of my Sigma art lenses, even when I was shooting on Canon DSLRs. It seems to be a trait of the lenses themselves that when you are shooting with not a lot of ambient light, that the lens slows the autofocus down to try and improve the autofocus accuracy. I think it will have the same trait even in an FE version. Where I think the FE version is going to be better than this setup is with the close focusing, even in good light. The fact that this one, when it gets to close to minimum focus distance, the lens struggles finding focus straight away. I think that won't be as much of an issue, or not an issue at all, with a native FE mount and the FE firmware. So if you primarily photograph outdoors in good light, you will probably find that the faster autofocus of the Sigma could be a benefit to you. If, however, you tend to work indoors with less ambient light, then you might get held back by the slower autofocus from the Sigma, and the Sony might be a better option for you. And lastly, the big difference, price. We're looking at £600 for the Sony versus £1,000 for the Sigma. So for me, out of these two, the Sony is the winner for me, because optically these two perform just as well as each other. You can get really sharp images from either one. Yes, the Sigma does have a slightly faster aperture, but as we've seen, you don't get the full benefit of that extra aperture because of the loss in light transmission. So overall, I think while the Sigma is a better lens, it has more potential from it, it's also a damn sight heavier, a lot less versatile, and is £400 more expensive than the Sony. So I think between the two, on balance, the Sony just offers much better value for money than what you get from the Sigma. But what do you think? Which is your favourite 85mm lens? Is it the Sony? Is it the Sigma? Is it a different lens entirely? Leave your thoughts and comments in the box down below. Thank you so much for stopping by, and hopefully I will see you in the next video.